A single candle flickered in the hospital room, casting trembling shadows across walls that had witnessed countless final breaths. Outside, the august cicadas of Petrich sang their eternal song, oblivious to the momentous scene unfolding within. The woman in the bed had lived 85 years, and for 60 of those years she had carried a burden that no ordinary soul could comprehend. Her sightless eyes, robbed of light decades ago by a merciless whirlwind, now seemed to gaze into dimensions beyond human perception. Death was close. She could feel its patient presence in the corner of the room, but there was one final task she needed to complete before surrendering to its embrace. Her niece, Lyubka, leaned close, straining to hear the whispered words that escaped those aged lips. The dying woman's hand, thin as parchment and marked by the passage of countless seasons, gestured weakly toward a small wooden chest that had accompanied her through wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires. Inside lay secrets that could shake the foundations of nations. The niece retrieved an old box from beneath the bed, its wood worn smooth by decades of handling, and placed it gently beside her aunt. With fingers that trembled from exhaustion rather than fear, the prophetess withdrew a sealed envelope. What she wrote upon it would become one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. The inscription was simple yet electrifying. Open in 2025, when the 8th changes everything. The niece stared at the cryptic words, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice. What cataclysm awaited humanity at that distant date? Who or what was the 8th? And why had her aunt chosen to seal these particular visions away from the world, locking them behind a barrier of time itself? The envelope disappeared back into the box, its secrets preserved for a generation yet unborn. The woman was Evangelia Pandeva Gushtarova, though the world knew her simply as Baba Vanga, the blind seer of Bulgaria, whose prophecies had allegedly achieved an accuracy rate of 85%. From humble peasant origins, she had risen to become perhaps the most consulted oracle of the 20th century. Kings and commissars, scientists and soldiers, the desperate and the powerful, all had made pilgrimages to her modest home, seeking glimpses of tomorrow. Communist authorities had tried to silence her, then decided to exploit her gifts instead. Documents about her remained classified in Bulgarian intelligence archives to this day. Now, in her final hours, the prophetess gathered her remaining strength to deliver one last transmission from whatever mysterious source had fed her visions for 6 decades. Her blind eyes suddenly opened wide, reflecting a light that seemed to emanate from another dimension entirely. The niece gasped and reached for her notepad, knowing that every word spoken in this sacred moment must be preserved. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an electricity that made the candle flame dance wildly. Baba Vanga began to speak in a voice transformed, deeper, resonant with otherworldly authority. She spoke of a great battle for the soul of humanity itself, a cosmic struggle between opposing forces that would determine the fate of civilization. West would clash against East in a confrontation that transcended mere politics or economics. Darkness would war against light across every continent and in every human heart. The outcome, she declared, was not predetermined. Humanity still possessed the power to choose its destiny. But the path ahead would be marked by tribulations that would test the very fabric of existence. Her words painted visions of apocalyptic transformation that made her niece's hand shake as she struggled to transcribe them. America, the great colossus of the Western world, would sink beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Europe, cradle of Western civilization, would fall to forces it could neither comprehend nor resist. But from the ashes of the old order, a new power would emerge triumphant. Russia would rise again, reborn and renewed, to assume leadership of a transformed world. And at the center of this transformation stood a figure whose name the prophetess pronounced with unmistakable clarity: Vladimir. He would come from Russia, she whispered, and he would become not merely a president or premier, but the true master of global destiny. The story begins not in a hospital room, but in a tiny village clinging to the rugged hillsides of Macedonia, where poverty was as common as the stones scattered across the fields. Strumitsa lay just 50 kilometers from the Greek border, a place where peasant families scratched their survival from unyielding soil and prayed to saints for deliverance from hardship. Here, on the 31st of January in 1911, a baby girl drew her first breath in a humble dwelling that offered little protection from winter's bite. Her parents named her Vangelia after the holy evangelists, perhaps hoping that divine favor might bless a child born into such desperate circumstances. Her father, Pandey Serchev, labored on neighboring farms, his calloused hands earning meager wages that barely sustained his growing family. Her mother, Paraskeva, managed the household while raising 3 children, each day a struggle against hunger and want. The family possessed nothing of material value, no land of their own, no prospects for advancement in a world that ground peasants beneath its indifferent heel. Yet they had something that wealth could never purchase, resilience forged through generations of survival. Little Vangelia grew up surrounded by this quiet strength, learning early that life demanded everything and promised nothing in return. Nothing distinguished this child from thousands of other peasant daughters scattered across the Balkan countryside. She helped with household chores as soon as her small hands could manage them, played games with neighboring children in dusty village lanes, and observed the rare festivals that punctuated the monotony of rural existence. The local priest saw nothing remarkable when he blessed her at church services. Village elders noted nothing unusual about the dark-haired girl who ran barefoot through summer meadows. Destiny, it seemed, had overlooked this particular corner of the world entirely, leaving its inhabitants to their anonymous struggles. Then came the first whispers of something extraordinary stirring beneath the surface of ordinary life. At 7 years old, Vangelia began describing dreams unlike any her parents had encountered. In these nocturnal visions, deceased relatives appeared before her with startling clarity, speaking messages from beyond the grave. Her grandmother, dead 3 winters past, offered warnings about coming storms. An uncle, claimed by fever years before, revealed the location of a lost family heirloom. The child recounted these encounters with innocent conviction, unaware that such experiences lay far outside the boundaries of normal childhood imagination. Her parents reacted with a mixture of fear and fascination that they dared not share beyond family walls. The village priest, when cautiously consulted, spoke darkly of demonic influence and prescribed holy water treatments. Neighbors would surely brand the girl as touched by evil spirits if word spread of her strange communications. So the family kept their daughter's peculiar gift hidden, hoping perhaps that she would outgrow these disturbing visitations. But the dreams continued, growing more vivid and more frequent, as if some supernatural force was slowly awakening within the child's consciousness and preparing her for a purpose not yet revealed. The 12th of May in 1925 arrived with no warning of the catastrophe it carried. 14-year-old Vanga ventured into the open fields with friends, their laughter echoing across meadows painted with spring wildflowers. The sky offered no omens, the air carried no portents of transformation. Then, without any preliminary signs, a violent whirlwind materialized from empty atmosphere and descended upon the unsuspecting children. The others scattered in terror, but Vanga found herself seized by invisible hands of tremendous force. The tornado lifted her bodily from the earth and hurled her through the air like a discarded doll. Her companions searched frantically, but found no trace of their friend in the chaos that followed. Night fell upon their failure, and with it came despair. Only the next morning did searchers discover her crumpled form in a ditch several kilometers distant from where she had vanished. She lay unconscious, her face a mask of dried blood, her eyes packed solid with sand and debris driven deep by the storm's fury. Physicians fought for months to save her vision, employing every technique their limited resources allowed. Their efforts proved futile against the damage wrought by nature's inexplicable violence. The girl who had once gazed upon Macedonian sunsets would never see light again. Yet something profound had shifted in the darkness that now enveloped her world. As physical sight faded permanently beyond recovery, another form of perception began awakening with terrifying intensity. The dead relatives who had previously visited only her dreams now spoke to her during waking hours. Events occurring in distant villages revealed themselves to her inner vision with impossible clarity. And gradually, tentatively, images of things yet to happen began flickering across the screen of her consciousness. Fragmentary at first, then increasingly coherent. The whirlwind had stolen her eyes, but bestowed upon her something far more extraordinary. windows into dimensions of time and space that remained forever closed to ordinary mortals. The Kremlin in February of 1943 was a fortress of paranoia and desperate hope, its ancient walls sheltering the nerve center of a nation fighting for survival. The Battle of Stalingrad had just concluded in Soviet victory, German forces shattered against the frozen banks of the Volga, yet the road to Berlin stretched impossibly far across blood-soaked landscapes. In Office Number 1, the most feared address in the Soviet Empire, Joseph Stalin reviewed reports and plotted strategy with the cold calculation that had carried him through decades of political carnage. Nothing escaped his attention. No detail proved too insignificant for scrutiny by those penetrating Georgian eyes. NKVD officers had brought an unusual matter before their supreme leader, a case that defied the materialist ideology upon which the Soviet state supposedly rested. Deep in Bulgaria, they reported, lived a blind peasant woman whose predictions had proven disturbingly accurate. She had allegedly foretold the precise location where German forces would attempt landings in the Caucasus region. More remarkably still, she had named the date when the murderous siege of Leningrad would finally lift. Intelligence operatives on the ground had verified these claims through careful investigation, ruling out the possibility of espionage or lucky guessing. Stalin listened with the skepticism of a seminary dropout who had long ago abandoned supernatural beliefs for the hard calculus of power. Yet he was also a Georgian, raised in a culture where mystics and holy fools commanded respect that transcended official doctrine. The dictator had survived countless assassination attempts, political purges, and military disasters through an almost preternatural instinct for danger. If this Bulgarian woman possessed genuine abilities, such a gift might prove useful to the Soviet cause. He ordered her brought to Moscow under conditions of absolute secrecy, her existence known only to a handful of trusted operatives. The woman who entered his office that winter day seemed utterly unremarkable at first glance. She was 32 years old, but appeared far older, her face weathered by hardship and her sightless eyes staring into emptiness. A simple black headscarf covered her hair in the manner of peasant women throughout the Balkans. Her name was Evangelia Dimitrova, though everyone called her simply Vanga. She moved with the careful deliberation of the blind, yet radiated a strange confidence that seemed inappropriate for a peasant standing before the most powerful man in the communist world. Stalin studied her with the same intensity he applied to rival politicians. Without preamble or diplomatic pleasantries, the dictator posed his challenge directly. "So, you claim to predict the future," he stated flatly, making no effort to conceal his skepticism. Vanga responded by requesting permission to touch his hand, explaining that physical contact helped focus her visions. Stalin hesitated momentarily, his legendary paranoia warring against curiosity, then extended his palm toward the blind woman. Her rough fingers closed around his hand with surprising gentleness. Seconds passed in absolute silence as guards tensed and aides held their breath. Then she released her grip and began speaking in a voice that seemed to emanate from somewhere far beyond that ornate Kremlin office. The words she spoke made the steel-nerved dictator visibly flinch, a reaction witnessed by several attendants who would carry the memory to their graves. Victory would come on the 9th of May, 1945, she declared with absolute certainty. Adolf Hitler would die by his own hand in an underground bunker on the 30th of April that same year, a bullet from his personal pistol ending the nightmare of Nazi tyranny. The Third Reich would crumble, Berlin would fall to Soviet forces, and the red banner would fly over the ruins of fascist dreams. Stalin nodded slowly, finding this prediction encouraging if impossible to verify until events unfolded. But then Vanga continued speaking, and her next words transformed encouragement into existential dread. She addressed Stalin directly, her blind eyes somehow finding his face with unnerving precision. "Comrade Stalin," she said quietly, "you will not long outlive your triumph. Death will claim you on the 5th of March, 1953, through a hemorrhage that floods your brain with blood. 10 years remained before that appointed hour, a decade during which the dictator would reign supreme over a vast empire. Yet the certainty in her voice permitted no doubt, no hope of escaping the fate she had pronounced upon him in that candlelit chamber. The dictator sat in stunned silence as the implications penetrated his consciousness. Here was no vague fortune-teller speaking in riddles that could mean anything. This woman had named precise dates, specific causes, exact circumstances that would either vindicate her claims or expose her as a fraud. Stalin dismissed the audience shortly thereafter, ordering that the Bulgarian prophetess be returned to her homeland under continued surveillance. Every prediction she made was to be recorded and transmitted to Moscow through secure channels. The encounter troubled him deeply, though he confided in no one. And when March 5th of 1953 finally arrived, Joseph Stalin collapsed at his dacha from a massive cerebral hemorrhage, dying exactly as the blind peasant woman had foretold 10 years before. The blind prophetess did not confine her revelations to Stalin's personal fate during that extraordinary Kremlin encounter. Her visions pierced far deeper into the fabric of Soviet destiny, unspooling a narrative of succession that would stretch across half a century of tumultuous history. When Stalin pressed her about what would follow his death, Vanga closed her sightless eyes and seemed to enter a trance state that transformed her voice into something ancient and oracular. The words she spoke would prove to be a roadmap of Russian leadership so precise that its accuracy defies rational explanation, a chronicle of rulers written decades before they would ascend to power. After you, she intoned, will come a bald one who is kind but weak. This successor would denounce the crimes of the Stalinist era and release millions from the brutal labor camps that scarred the Soviet conscience. Yet his fundamental softness would prove his undoing, leaving him vulnerable to betrayal by those he trusted most. Stalin listened with the cold attention of a chess master analyzing moves on a distant board. The description matched no obvious candidate in his current circle, yet the specificity of the portrait suggested genuine foresight rather than vague generalization. He filed the information away in his formidable memory. The procession of future leaders continued to march through Vanga's prophetic vision with relentless clarity. Following the bald reformer would come a man distinguished by thick eyebrows, she declared, a leader who would reign for precisely 18 years. His era would bring stability, but also stagnation, a long twilight during which the revolutionary flame would gutter toward extinction. Then 2 old men would hold power briefly, their combined tenure lasting merely a year and 3 months before death claimed them both. Finally would emerge a young leader bearing a distinctive birthmark upon his head, and under his well-intentioned but catastrophic rule, the entire Soviet Union would shatter into fragments. Stalin ordered immediate implementation of permanent surveillance upon the Bulgarian oracle following their meeting. A specialized team of NKVD officers established residence in Petrich, with instructions to document every utterance that escaped her lips. All predictions were to be encrypted and transmitted to Moscow through the most secure courier channels available. No detail was too minor for recording, no visitor too insignificant for notation. The Kremlin wanted a complete archive of this woman's pronouncements, creating what would become known in classified circles as the Bulgarian file, one of the most closely guarded secrets in Soviet intelligence history. The accuracy that emerged from this systematic documentation proved nothing short of staggering to those with clearance to examine the records. Nikita Khrushchev rose to power after Stalin's death exactly as described. A bald reformer who dismantled the cult of personality and opened the Gulag gates for countless prisoners. His secret speech denouncing Stalinist crimes shocked the communist world, yet his impulsive nature and agricultural failures ultimately sealed his doom. In October of 1964, his own colleagues removed him from power in a bloodless coup that vindicated Vanga's assessment of weakness. The first domino had fallen precisely as prophesied. Leonid Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev and proceeded to rule for exactly 18 years, his bushy eyebrows becoming iconic symbols of the Soviet state during the long period historians would later term the era of stagnation. The economy calcified, innovation withered, and a gerontocracy of aging apparatchiks clung to power, while the nation slowly decayed beneath elaborate facades of socialist achievement. When Brezhnev finally died in November of 1982, he was followed by Yuri Andropov, who survived only 15 months before kidney failure claimed him. Then Konstantin Chernenko, who managed barely 13 months before emphysema ended his tenure. The combined reign of these two old men totaled exactly 1 year and 3 months, matching Vanga's prediction with eerie precision. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, the youngest general secretary in Soviet history, his forehead marked by a distinctive port wine birthmark that no observer could miss. He launched ambitious reforms called glasnost and perestroika, hoping to save the communist system through controlled liberalization. Instead, he unleashed forces that would tear the empire apart. Republic after republic declared independence as the center lost all capacity to hold. The hammer and sickle banner descended from Kremlin towers on December 25, 1991, ending 7 decades of Soviet power precisely as the blind Bulgarian had foreseen 6 years before that momentous Christmas night. And still, her prophecy extended further into the uncertain future that lay beyond the Soviet collapse. In the year 2000, Vanga had declared during that original Kremlin audience, a man named Vladimir would seize power in Russia. He would emerge from obscurity to rebuild the shattered nation, restoring its greatness through methods both admired and feared. The name had seemed arbitrary when first recorded in classified documents, a random Russian appellation that could belong to thousands of potential candidates. Yet, when Vladimir Putin assumed the presidency on the final day of 1999, inheriting power from an exhausted Boris Yeltsin, those with access to the Bulgarian file felt chills cascade down their spines at the realization of prophecy fulfilled. The Soviet intelligence apparatus had never encountered anything like the blind woman from Petrich, and the implications of her abilities sent tremors through the labyrinthine corridors of state security. If one peasant could genuinely perceive future events, might there be others scattered across the vast territories under communist control? Could such gifts be cultivated, weaponized, turned into instruments of state power? These questions consumed the analytical minds tasked with assessing the Bulgarian file, transforming what began as curiosity into full-scale institutional obsession. The machinery of secret knowledge began grinding toward a destination none of its operators could have anticipated. In March of 1944, with the war's outcome still uncertain despite Soviet advances, Lavrenti Beria decided that second-hand reports no longer sufficed. The NKVD chief was perhaps the most feared man in the Soviet Empire after Stalin himself, a fellow Georgian whose administrative genius concealed depths of cruelty that made hardened interrogators blanch. He had orchestrated purges that devoured millions, signed execution orders with the casual indifference of a bureaucrat processing routine paperwork. Now, this architect of terror flew secretly to Bulgaria, determined to assess the prophetess personally and extract whatever strategic value her visions might offer the Soviet cause. The meeting took place at a conspiratorial dacha outside Sofia, its location known only to a handful of trusted operatives. Beria arrived without ceremony or entourage, accompanied solely by a translator whose tongue would be permanently silenced should he ever speak of what transpired. The NKVD chief was a man utterly devoid of superstition, a materialist who believed only in power and the instruments of its application. Yet something in the classified reports had intrigued him sufficiently to justify this extraordinary journey. He intended to probe this supposed oracle with the same merciless precision he applied to political prisoners. Vanga received the most dangerous man in the Soviet security apparatus with an equanimity that unsettled even his iron composure. She requested an object of personal significance to focus her visions, and Beria reluctantly surrendered his Communist Party membership pin. The blind woman held the small metal emblem between weathered fingers, her sightless eyes closed in concentration that seemed to transport her consciousness across vast distances of time and space. Minutes passed in silence so complete that the guards outside could hear their own heartbeats. Then she spoke, and her words addressed the question burning foremost in Beria's calculating mind. "The war will conclude on the 9th of May, 1945, she declared with absolute certainty. Germany will sign an act of unconditional capitulation in Berlin, its thousand-year Reich reduced to rubble and ash after barely a dozen years of existence. Soviet forces will plant their banner atop the Reichstag, and the world will celebrate victory over fascism." Beria absorbed this intelligence with satisfaction, already contemplating how such foreknowledge might be exploited for strategic advantage. He pressed for additional details about military operations, seeking any information that might accelerate victory or reduce Soviet casualties. But then Vanga's voice shifted into registers that made the temperature in the room seem to plummet. She addressed Beria directly, her blind gaze somehow finding his face with precision that violated all natural law. The prophecy she delivered next transformed his satisfaction into existential terror. 10 years after the war ends, she said quietly, you will face execution. They will shoot you in secret, in a basement, and announce to the people that you were an enemy all along. History will record you as a traitor to the very state you served with such terrible dedication. The blood you spilled will cry out for justice, and justice will find you. Beria's response revealed the depth of his disturbance more eloquently than any verbal protestation could have managed. He immediately ordered intensified surveillance of the Bulgarian oracle, demanding that every whisper she uttered be captured and analyzed. Resources poured into the Petrich operation as teams of observers worked in rotating shifts to ensure no prophecy escaped documentation. The NKVD chief returned to Moscow deeply shaken, though he confided his personal prediction to no one. He threw himself into the remaining war effort with redoubled ferocity, perhaps hoping that sufficient service to the state might somehow deflect the doom pronounced upon him. The war ended precisely as Vanga had foretold. German capitulation signed in Berlin on the 9th of May, 1945. Beria continued accumulating power throughout the post-war years, becoming one of the most influential figures in Stalin's inner circle. Then, Stalin died in March of 1953, and the political landscape shifted with terrifying speed. Beria's rivals moved against him within months, arresting the feared security chief on charges of treason and espionage. On December 23rd of that year, exactly as prophesied, Lavrenti Beria was executed by firing squad in the basement of Lubyanka prison. The public was told he had been a British spy and enemy of the Soviet people all along. The supernatural accuracy of the Bulgarian file sent shockwaves reverberating through the highest levels of Soviet leadership when news of Beria's execution spread among those with appropriate clearances. Here was prophecy fulfilled to the letter, a prediction made 9 years earlier that had materialized with horrible precision, despite all the power and cunning its subject had commanded. The new leadership recognized that they possessed something unprecedented, a genuine window into future events that transcended all conventional intelligence methodologies. A special division within the KGB was established to study paranormal phenomena systematically, its mandate including the identification and recruitment of others who might possess abilities similar to those of the remarkable blind woman from Petrich. The blind oracle's visions ranged far beyond the political intrigues and power struggles that consumed Kremlin corridors, extending into realms of technological achievement that would have seemed pure fantasy to earlier generations. She spoke of humanity reaching toward the stars with the same certainty she applied to predicting the fates of dictators and the outcomes of wars. Soviet leaders who consulted her found themselves receiving intelligence about scientific breakthroughs that their own research institutes had not yet imagined, glimpses of triumphs that would transform humanity's relationship with the cosmos itself. The prophetess from Petrich was mapping territories of the future that stretched beyond earthly concerns entirely. In 1959, during a secret consultation arranged through Bulgarian state security channels, Vanga delivered a prophecy that seemed to belong more to science fiction than serious intelligence assessment. She spoke of a Russian lad named Yuri who would soon journey beyond the atmosphere itself, becoming the first human being to orbit the Earth. The flight would occur in April of 1961, she specified, and would last precisely 108 minutes. Skeptical officials recorded her words with the professional diligence their positions required, filing the prediction alongside countless others in archives that grew thicker with each passing year. The details she provided seemed impossibly specific for an uneducated peasant woman who had never seen a rocket or studied physics. She described the spacecraft as a metal sphere carrying its passenger around the planet at speeds no human had ever experienced. She spoke of the cosmonaut gazing down upon Earth from heights previously reserved for celestial bodies alone. The name Yuri meant nothing to intelligence analysts at the time, matching no prominent figure in the Soviet space program's publicly known hierarchy. Yet the certainty in her voice permitted no ambiguity, no hedging of prophetic bets against future embarrassment. On the 12th of April, 1961, Yuri Gagarin launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome aboard Vostok 1, becoming the first human to journey into outer space. His flight lasted exactly 108 minutes, carrying him once around the planet before returning safely to Soviet soil. The world erupted in celebration of this unprecedented achievement, crowds gathering in Moscow to honor the young cosmonaut whose smile would become iconic. In classified offices where the Bulgarian file was maintained, analysts compared Vanga's prediction against actual events and found correspondence so precise that coincidence seemed an inadequate explanation. 2 years later, the prophetess added another cosmic prophecy to her remarkable portfolio. She spoke of a Russian woman named Valentina who would follow Gagarin's path into the heavens, shattering barriers of gender as thoroughly as the first cosmonaut had shattered barriers of gravity. The flight would occur in June, she declared, and would prove that space belonged to all humanity rather than merely to men. On the 16th of June, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova launched aboard Vostok 6, orbiting Earth 48 times over nearly 3 days. Another prophecy had materialized from the darkness behind Vanga's sightless eyes into the light of documented history. But not all visions from the blind oracle carried tidings of triumph and human advancement. In March of 1980, a state security officer conducting routine documentation recorded words that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Vanga spoke of fire that water could not extinguish, an invisible flame that would kill everything living while leaving structures eerily intact. She located this catastrophe in the north of Ukraine, naming a place few had heard of at the time. The disaster would strike on the 26th of April, 1986, she specified, unleashing poisons that would spread across an entire continent on winds that recognized no borders. The officer dutifully transcribed her description of an atomic cauldron exploding in the night, its protective containment shattered by forces that human arrogance had failed to anticipate. She spoke of a city that would empty forever, its inhabitants fleeing a menace they could neither see nor smell nor taste. The land itself would die, she declared, remaining poisoned for 300 years while nature slowly reclaimed what humanity had been forced to abandon. Most haunting was her description of the ruined building afterward, its metal beams protruding toward the sky like the ribs of some monstrous skeleton, a cathedral of catastrophe marking humanity's hubris. 6 years later, at 23 minutes past 1 on the morning of April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a safety test gone catastrophically wrong. Radioactive contamination spread across Europe exactly as the blind woman had foreseen. The city of Pripyat was evacuated within 36 hours, its 50,000 residents never to return. A 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established around the ruined facility, transforming once fertile Ukrainian countryside into a haunted wasteland. Photographs of the destroyed reactor building showed twisted metal beams reaching skyward from the shattered structure, skeletal fingers pointing accusingly at heaven. precisely matching the image Vanga had described 6 years before the disaster occurred. The Chernobyl prophecy elevated the Bulgarian file to unprecedented importance within Soviet leadership circles. Mikhail Gorbachev himself reportedly examined the relevant documents, confronting evidence that this peasant woman had foreseen his nation's greatest technological catastrophe with accuracy that defied all materialist explanation. If she had predicted Chernobyl with such terrible precision, what other warnings might lie buried in the accumulated archives of her prophecies? Teams of analysts began systematically reviewing decades of recorded predictions, searching for threats that might still be prevented and opportunities that might yet be seized. The blind oracle of Petrich had become perhaps the most valuable intelligence asset the Soviet state possessed. Among the countless prophecies that flowed from the blind oracle throughout her remarkable lifetime, none captured imagination quite like the mysterious doctrine she began expounding in 1987. Soviet journalists who secured rare interviews found themselves recording words that seemed to transcend ordinary political prediction, entering territories of almost messianic expectation. Vanga spoke of a sequence of rulers that would govern Russia across more than a century of tumultuous history, building toward a climactic figure whose arrival would transform not merely one nation, but the entire human civilization. This teaching of the eighth ruler would become the most debated and anticipated element of her prophetic legacy. She enumerated the succession with the confidence of someone reading from a document already written by fate itself. Lenin stood first in the sequence, the revolutionary who had shattered the old order and erected a new empire upon its ruins. Stalin came second, the man of steel who had industrialized a peasant nation through methods of incomprehensible brutality. Khrushchev occupied the third position, the reformer who had denounced his predecessor's crimes while lacking the strength to fully escape their shadow. Brezhnev followed as fourth, the eye-browed bureaucrat who had presided over long stagnation while the system slowly calcified around him. The fifth ruler, Vanga continued, was Gorbachev himself, the birthmarked reformer whose well-intentioned efforts would inadvertently destroy the very structure he sought to save. Sixth would come Yeltsin, a figure of chaos and contradiction who would preside over the painful transition from communist certainty to capitalist confusion. Seventh was Vladimir, the name she had pronounced decades earlier, the leader who would restore Russian strength and pride after years of humiliation. Each identification corresponded precisely to actual historical sequence, a framework that lent credibility to her claims about the figure yet to emerge at the sequence's culmination. The eighth ruler remained shrouded in prophetic mystery, yet Vanga provided enough details to tantalize those who recorded her words. This final leader would emerge in 2027 or 2028, she declared, arriving at a moment when humanity had grown exhausted from wars and material pursuits. Unlike his predecessors, he would not rise through military ranks or intelligence services. Instead, she described a young man of profound intellectual gifts, perhaps a scientist who had unlocked secrets of nature, or a philosopher who had discovered truths about human existence that others had overlooked. His spirituality would distinguish him above all other characteristics, Vanga emphasized repeatedly when discussing this ultimate ruler. Where previous leaders had governed through ideology or force, the eighth would lead through moral authority so compelling that coercion became unnecessary. People would follow him not because laws commanded obedience, but because their hearts recognized wisdom when they encountered it. She spoke of this figure in terms that echoed ancient prophecies about enlightened kings whose righteousness would radiate outward to heal wounded civilizations. Russia had produced many rulers, but none like the one whose coming she foresaw. Under the eighth ruler's guidance, Moscow would finally fulfill the destiny that Orthodox theologians had proclaimed centuries earlier. The Russian capital would become the third Rome not merely in religious rhetoric, but in practical reality, a spiritual center to which all peoples would turn for guidance and inspiration. The corruption and cynicism that had corroded previous Russian governments would dissolve before the eighth's incorruptible example. Justice would flow through institutions that had known only manipulation and self-interest. A transformation more profound than any revolution would sweep across the vast Eurasian landmass. The methods of this coming ruler represented the most radical departure from Russian historical experience that Vanga described. He would govern not through fear, but through love, she insisted. Not through force, but through the quiet authority of demonstrated wisdom. Prisons would empty because crime itself would wither in a society where spiritual fulfillment replaced material desperation as humanity's primary motivation. Armies would disband because the causes of war would evaporate when nations recognized their fundamental unity. These claims seemed utopian beyond credibility, yet the blind woman pronounced them with the same certainty she had applied to predictions that subsequently proved accurate. The Golden Age inaugurated by the eighth ruler would persist for 1,000 years, according to Vanga's most expansive prophecies. Humanity would enter an era of unprecedented flourishing, with scientific advancement accelerating beyond current imagination, while spiritual wisdom provided ethical frameworks to ensure that progress served genuine human welfare. Borders between nations would fade into irrelevance as people recognized that they shared one planetary home. The conflicts that had scarred human history since civilization's dawn would finally cease, replaced by cooperation directed toward purposes worthy of beings capable of contemplating infinity. Whether the eighth ruler prophecy represents genuine foresight or wishful thinking projected onto a suffering world remains impossible to determine until the appointed years arrive. Skeptics note that predictions of coming savior figures appear across virtually all human cultures, expressing hopes rather than foreknowledge. Yet Vanga's track record on more verifiable predictions demands that her words receive serious consideration rather than dismissive rejection. The years 2027 and 2028 approach with increasing speed. Somewhere, perhaps, a young person of exceptional gifts prepares unknowingly for a destiny that was pronounced before their birth by a blind woman who could see what others could not. Decades before the name Vladimir Putin entered global consciousness, the blind prophetess of Petrich spoke of a leader whose arrival would resurrect Russian greatness from the ashes of Soviet collapse. She described this figure with details so specific that their subsequent fulfillment strains the boundaries of coincidental explanation, painting a portrait that would only find its subject years after her death. The Vladimir prophecy, as researchers would later term this cluster of predictions, represents perhaps the most striking example of Vanga's apparent ability to perceive individuals not yet risen to historical significance. Her words mapped a destiny that their subject had not yet begun to fulfill. The leader would be born in a city on the Neva River, Vanga declared during interviews in the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union still stood and its future dissolution remained unimaginable to most observers. She specified further that his birth would occur during a year of the dragon, according to the Chinese zodiac, an astrological detail that seemed oddly specific for a Bulgarian peasant woman with no particular connection to Asian traditions. Intelligence analysts who maintained the Bulgarian file noted these characteristics without comprehending their significance, filing them alongside thousands of other recorded utterances awaiting future verification or refutation. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin entered the world on the 7th of October, 1952, in the city then known as Leningrad, situated upon the banks of the Neva River precisely as prophesied. The year 1952 corresponds to the dragon in Chinese astrological cycles, fulfilling the second identifying characteristic with precision that permits no ambiguity. At the time of his birth, nothing distinguished this infant from millions of other Soviet children beginning their lives in post-war Russia. His father worked in a factory. His mother had survived the horrific Leningrad siege. Destiny had marked him, yet decades would pass before that marking became visible to the world. Vanga described the character and governing style of this coming Vladimir with observations that would prove remarkably prescient. He would be harsh but just, she proclaimed, a leader whose severity served purposes larger than personal aggrandizement. The chaos that would follow Soviet dissolution demanded a firm hand capable of imposing order upon anarchy. This Vladimir would provide that hand, disciplining the oligarchs who had plundered national resources during the lawless 1990s and restoring dignity to a state that had become an object of international ridicule. His methods might disturb Western sensibilities, but they would achieve results that gentler approaches had failed to produce. The military and security services would experience particular restoration under Vladimir's leadership, the prophetess continued. Russia's armed forces had deteriorated into demoralized shells of their former capability during the post-Soviet chaos, soldiers going unpaid while equipment rusted into obsolescence. The intelligence agencies that had once commanded global respect found themselves fragmented and purposeless after the empire they served dissolved overnight. Vladimir would rebuild these institutions with the understanding of an insider who had served within their ranks, recognizing that national strength ultimately rested upon foundations of security and order that only disciplined forces could provide. His relationships with various constituencies followed patterns Vanga outlined with notable accuracy. Enemies would fear him, she stated flatly, and the fates of those who challenged Putin's authority suggest this prediction achieved abundant fulfillment. Oligarchs who resisted state reassertion of control found themselves imprisoned or exiled. Political opponents encountered obstacles that ranged from legal prosecution to far darker consequences. Foreign adversaries discovered that the new Russian leader possessed both will and capability to defend national interests through means that previous post-Soviet leadership had lacked. The fear Vanga prophesied proved well-founded among those who earned Vladimir's enmity. Friends and allies would offer respect rather than the condescension that had characterized Western attitudes toward Russia during its weakened years. China recognized a partner worthy of serious strategic cooperation. India maintained traditional ties while expanding economic relationships. Nations across the developing world saw in Vladimir a leader willing to challenge American unipolarity, offering alternative alignments for those dissatisfied with Washington's dominance. The pivot eastward that Vanga foresaw materialized steadily throughout Putin's tenure, creating the multipolar architecture she had described decades before its construction commenced. Most remarkably, the blind prophetess predicted territorial transformations that seemed impossible when she pronounced them. Crimea will detach from one shore and attach to another, she declared. Words that made no sense when Ukraine and Russia both remained constituent republics of a unified Soviet state. Only after 1991 did the prophecy acquire meaning, with Crimea becoming Ukrainian territory through administrative accident rather than popular will. When Russian forces facilitated a referendum in March of 2014, 96% of Crimean voters chose reunification with Russia. The peninsula had detached from one shore and attached to another, exactly as Vanga had foreseen, fulfilling prophecy through geopolitical upheaval that reshaped European security arrangements. The Vladimir prophecy continues unfolding as events progress beyond the blind woman's death, each development subject to interpretation through the lens she provided. Supporters view Putin as precisely the strong leader Vanga promised, a necessary corrective to the humiliations Russia suffered during its chaotic transition. Critics see authoritarianism dressed in prophetic legitimacy, ancient superstition providing cover for modern repression. What remains beyond dispute is the extraordinary correspondence between predictions made decades ago and realities observable today. Whether Vanga glimpsed genuine destiny or simply issued pronouncements vague enough to accommodate multiple outcomes, the Vladimir prophecy has achieved a cultural significance that shapes how millions understand their present moment. 2 years after the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 separate nations, a journalist from a Kiev newspaper secured an interview with the elderly prophetess, whose fame had spread far beyond Bulgarian borders. The questions focused naturally on Ukraine's future, this newly independent state navigating uncertain waters between its Soviet past and European aspirations. What Vanga revealed during that 1993 conversation reads today less like mystical prophecy than classified intelligence briefing, a document so precisely aligned with subsequent events that its existence troubles rational explanation. The Ukrainian crucible, as this interview would later be termed, mapped 3 decades of tragedy before the first act had even commenced. Ukraine will not know peace for 30 years, the blind woman declared to her interviewer, her sightless eyes seeming to gaze upon horrors not yet born. The country would find itself torn between irreconcilable orientations, eastern regions gravitating toward historic Russian connections, while western territories reached toward European integration. This internal division would poison political discourse, prevent stable governance, and ultimately fracture the nation itself. The journalist recorded these words during a period of relative optimism, when newly independent Ukraine seemed poised to chart its own course, free from imperial domination. Vanga's pessimism must have seemed excessive at the time. She specified that the decisive rupture would occur in 2014, a date 2 decades distant when the interview took place. The country would lose Crimea that year, she stated, along with territories in its eastern regions where Russian-speaking populations predominated. These losses would not result from foreign invasion in the conventional sense, but from internal contradictions that external actors would exploit. The nation that had inherited the second-largest nuclear arsenal in the world would find itself dismembered by forces it could neither control nor comprehend. Her words captured tragedy's architecture before construction had begun. The Maidan Uprising received descriptions so precise that witnesses to those events might suspect the prophetess had observed them personally. People will stand for 3 months in winter on the main square of Kyiv, she revealed, enduring cold and danger for principles they hold sacred. They will demand change with persistence that authorities cannot break through force or intimidation. Ultimately, their president will flee to Russia, abandoning power rather than facing the crowds whose patience has outlasted his legitimacy. The Euromaidan protests of 2013 and 14 unfolded exactly according to this script, culminating in Viktor Yanukovych's February flight to Russian territory. Following the Maidan Revolution, Vanga foresaw extended conflict in Ukraine's eastern Donbass region that would consume years without producing resolution. Brother will fight brother in cities whose names the world will learn through suffering, she prophesied, describing warfare that seemed impossible between peoples so recently united under common Soviet identity. This conflict would persist for 8 years, she specified, destroying lives and infrastructure while diplomatic efforts repeatedly failed to achieve lasting settlement. The Donbass War that erupted in April 2014 continued through exactly 8 years of frozen stalemate, validating her timeline with grim precision. Then came the prophecy that transformed regional tragedy into global crisis. In 2022, Vanga declared, Russia will move to liberate its Ukrainian brothers from forces that threaten their existence. This action will shock the world, which will unite in condemnation against Moscow. Sanctions will flow, alliances will solidify, and Russia will find itself isolated as never before in modern memory. Yet isolation will not mean defeat. The prophetess insisted that Russia would endure whatever pressures the international community applied, drawing upon reserves of resilience that outsiders perpetually underestimated. On the 24th of February 2022, Russian forces crossed Ukrainian borders in what Moscow termed a special military operation. The global response materialized precisely as Vanga had foreseen nearly 3 decades earlier. Western nations imposed unprecedented economic sanctions. NATO unity strengthened rather than fractured. Military aid flowed to Ukrainian defenders in quantities that would have seemed unimaginable before the invasion commenced. Russia found itself facing coordinated opposition from virtually the entire developed world, its economy targeted for destruction, its leadership branded as criminal. The blind woman's vision of international alignment against Moscow achieved complete fulfillment. The war would last 3 years, Vanga had specified, concluding with what she termed the victory of justice. This element of the prophecy remains unfulfilled as events continue unfolding, its meaning subject to interpretation that depends heavily upon the interpreter's perspective. Russian sources understand justice as vindication of their stated war aims. Ukrainian voices define justice as restoration of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Western observers await outcomes that will determine which understanding history ultimately validates. The prophetess did not specify whose justice would prevail, leaving this crucial detail shrouded in ambiguity that only time can resolve. What cannot be disputed is the extraordinary alignment between Vanga's 1993 interview and events that subsequently transpired across 3 decades of Ukrainian history. She identified the timeline of internal conflict with precision, She foresaw the 2014 fracturing and territorial losses. She described the Maidan uprising and presidential flight accurately. She predicted 8 years of inconclusive Donbass warfare. She announced the 2022 escalation and global response against Russia. Whether these correspondences reflect genuine prophetic insight or represent retrospective interpretation imposed upon ambiguous statements, the Ukrainian crucible stands as perhaps the most thoroughly documented test case of Vanga's claimed abilities, a prophecy whose verification continues with each passing day of ongoing conflict. No nation drew sharper condemnation from the blind prophetess than the United States of America, the superpower whose global dominance she viewed as spiritual corruption masquerading as civilizational achievement. Vanga reserved her most apocalyptic language for predictions concerning America's fate, employing biblical imagery that transformed geopolitical analysis into theological pronouncement. Her visions of American collapse combined natural catastrophe with social disintegration in scenarios so extreme that they seemed designed more to frighten than to inform. Yet, given her accuracy regarding other predictions, dismissing these prophecies entirely requires courage that careful observers might reasonably lack. America is the new Babylon, she declared during interviews that spanned her final decades, invoking the ancient empire whose pride had provoked divine destruction according to scriptural tradition. Just as that original Babylon had fallen for its arrogance and wickedness, so too would its modern successor face judgment for sins accumulated across centuries of imperial expansion. The punishment would arrive not through foreign invasion or military defeat, but through calamities that no arsenal could repel, no technology could prevent. Sky, earth, and sea would unite as instruments of retribution against a civilization that had forgotten the humility its power demanded. The prophecies concerning natural disasters painted scenes of devastation that would fundamentally reshape American geography. California, the Golden State whose wealth and influence symbolized American prosperity, would suffer catastrophic destruction through seismic violence. A great earthquake would split the landmass itself, sending the cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco sliding beneath Pacific waters that would claim millions of lives within hours. Vanga specified this catastrophe would occur in 2023 or 2024, dates that have passed without the predicted destruction materializing, providing skeptics with welcome evidence against her reliability. The eastern seaboard would face different but equally terrifying devastation, according to Vanga's visions. A massive hurricane unlike any previously recorded would assault New York City, overwhelming defenses that had never been designed to withstand such fury. Skyscrapers celebrated as monuments to human ambition would collapse like card houses before winds that recognized no engineering achievement. Floodwaters would surge through streets where millions once walked, transforming urban canyons into watery graves. Most haunting was her image of the Statue of Liberty herself, that symbol of American ideals, standing submerged to her shoulders in waters that had conquered the nation she welcomed immigrants toward. Economic collapse would precede or accompany these natural catastrophes in Vanga's prophetic framework. The dollar, cornerstone of global financial architecture since the Second World War, would crash around 2022 or 2023, she predicted, dragging American prosperity into abysses from which recovery might prove impossible. Debts accumulated across decades of deficit spending would finally demand payment that empty treasuries could not provide. The nation that had lectured others about fiscal responsibility would discover its own accounts hopelessly overdrawn. Poverty would descend upon populations accustomed to affluence, generating social instability that comfortable generations had never imagined experiencing. Internal divisions would transform into outright warfare as American society fractured along fault lines that peaceful times had merely papered over. Racial tensions that periodically erupted in urban unrest would escalate into sustained conflict between communities whose grievances had festered for generations. Religious differences would sharpen into violence as competing visions of national identity proved irreconcilable through democratic processes. A new civil war would ignite, Vanga prophesied, lasting 7 years and consuming lives in numbers that would dwarf the 19th century conflict Americans considered their bloodiest. Brother would again fight brother across landscapes scarred by hatreds unleashed. The ultimate indignity awaited Americans who sought escape from their collapsing homeland. Millions would flee across borders and oceans, Vanga predicted, abandoning the nation their ancestors had built in desperate search for safety elsewhere. Like rats deserting a sinking ship, she described them with imagery designed to emphasize the reversal of historical patterns that had seen America as destination rather than departure point. These refugees would discover that welcome extended to the powerful rarely survives the loss of power. Nations that had received American tourists with enthusiasm would reject American migrants with contempt, leaving the displaced to discover what countless other refugee populations had already learned about international compassion. The harshness of these prophecies raises questions about motivation that purely predictive models cannot address. Did Vanga genuinely perceive American catastrophe through whatever channels fed her visions? Or did political and cultural antipathies shape pronouncements that reflected hostility more than foresight? The Cold War context of her most active decades placed Bulgaria firmly within the Soviet sphere, potentially coloring attitudes toward the capitalist superpower that opposed everything her government officially represented. Separating authentic prophecy from ideological wishful thinking challenges even sympathetic interpreters of her legacy. What remains certain is that the American prophecies have generated enormous interest among those who believe civilizational collapse approaches with accelerating speed. Social media amplifies every earthquake, hurricane, and civil disturbance as potential confirmation of Vanga's darkest visions. Economic instability triggers speculation about imminent dollar collapse. Political polarization fuels fears of coming civil war. Whether these anxieties reflect genuine prophetic fulfillment or merely the tendency of frightened populations to find patterns confirming their fears, the fall of Babylon prophecy continues resonating with audiences convinced that American supremacy cannot endure indefinitely. Time alone will reveal whether Vanga glimpsed genuine catastrophe or simply expressed hopes that her nation's adversary would someday face judgment for its sins. The prophetess who had charted Soviet succession and American collapse turned her sightless gaze upon Europe with visions that provoked outrage and fascination in equal measure. Where America faced divine punishment for imperial arrogance, the ancient continent that had birthed Western civilization confronted a different destiny entirely. Vanga spoke of transformations so complete that the Europe emerging from it would bear no resemblance to the culture that had produced cathedrals and universities, parliaments, and philosophies. Her prophecies concerning European Islamization remain among the most controversial elements of her legacy, embraced by some as warning and condemned by others as bigotry dressed in mystical clothing. By 2043, Europe will cease to be Christian, she declared in interviews that gained wider circulation after her death than they had received during her lifetime. The mechanism of this transformation would not involve military conquest in any traditional sense. Instead, demographic mathematics would accomplish what Ottoman armies had failed to achieve centuries earlier. Muslim families settling across the continent would produce 5 or 6 children on average, while native European families limited themselves to 1 or 2 offspring. Simple arithmetic projected across generations would shift population balances inexorably toward Islamic majorities in nation after nation. The political consequences of demographic transformation would unfold through the very democratic institutions Europeans celebrated as civilizational achievements. Within a generation of achieving majority status, Muslim populations would win elections that previous generations of secular Europeans had assumed would perpetuate their values indefinitely. Democratically elected governments would proceed to implement Sharia law through legitimate legislative processes, transforming legal frameworks that had evolved across centuries of Christian and Enlightenment influence. The ballot box would prove more effective than the sword in reshaping European civilization according to Islamic principles. Vanga described specific transformations that would mark this continental conversion with architectural and symbolic finality. Paris, the city of lights that had epitomized European sophistication for centuries, would become an Islamic metropolis. The great Cathedral of Notre Dame, masterpiece of Gothic Christianity that had survived revolution and world wars, would find itself converted into a mosque serving the faith of new demographic majorities. The call to prayer would echo through streets where church bells had once marked the hours. France, eldest daughter of the Catholic Church, would embrace a different spiritual patrimony entirely. Germany would experience its own transformation through surrender rather than resistance, the prophetess continued. Berlin would accept Islamization without the struggle that pride might have demanded, its population too diminished by guilt over 20th century atrocities to assert cultural self-preservation. The nation that had twice plunged Europe into catastrophic warfare would prove incapable of defending its own civilizational inheritance against peaceful demographic displacement. Vanga attributed this acquiescence to psychological complexes rooted in Holocaust memory, suggesting that German identity had been so thoroughly damaged by Nazi crimes that its inheritors could mount no defense against replacement. Turkey would emerge as architect of a resurrected Ottoman Empire encompassing territories its predecessor had ruled for centuries. Bulgaria, Vanga's own homeland, would fall within this neo-imperial sphere alongside Serbia, Greece, and other Balkan nations. Constantinople, the city Turks called Istanbul, would reclaim its historical status as capital of the Islamic world, seat of a caliphate whose authority would extend across continents. The Byzantine inheritance that Orthodox Christians had mourned for 5 centuries would pass definitively into Islamic possession, its churches completing transformations into mosques that Mehmed the Conqueror had initiated in 1453. Europeans would not accept civilizational extinction without resistance, Vanga acknowledged, but their efforts would prove tragically futile against forces they had welcomed through misguided tolerance. Religious wars lasting 20 years would erupt across the continent as native populations belatedly recognized threats that demographic statistics had long advertised. Christians would fight desperately to preserve identities their ancestors had maintained through centuries of challenge, but numerical disadvantages and spiritual exhaustion would doom their struggles. Those who survived would face stark choices between conversion, exile, or subordinate status within societies their forebears had built. Yet total annihilation would not prove Europe's final fate, according to Vanga's most expansive prophecies. Russia, the great Slavic power that had preserved Orthodox Christianity through Mongol occupation and communist persecution, would ultimately intervene to prevent complete civilizational collapse. Russian armies would march westward, not as conquerors, but as liberators, reaching Gibraltar itself in campaigns that would restore Christian worship to lands where it had been suppressed. The Europe that emerged from this salvation would bear little resemblance to its predecessor, transformed into an Orthodox and Slavic civilization aligned with Moscow rather than the secular liberal order that had preceded Islamic transformation. These prophecies generate fierce debate among those who encounter them, touching sensitivities that reasonable people navigate carefully. Supporters view Vanga's words as courageous warning against demographic trends that official discourse refuses to acknowledge honestly. Critics denounce them as xenophobic fantasy, providing supernatural validation for prejudices that deserve condemnation rather than prophetic endorsement. The blind woman herself offered no political program, no policy recommendations, no prescriptions for preventing the futures she described. She claimed merely to report what her visions revealed, leaving interpretation and response to those who possessed sight she had long ago sacrificed to the whirlwind that transformed a peasant girl into history's most consulted oracle. The final years of the blind prophetess blazed with urgency that those around her could feel intensifying as mortality approached. Vanga sensed death's patient advance and understood that time remaining for transmission of her visions grew desperately short. She organized her papers with meticulous care, dictating instructions to those trusted with preserving her legacy. Most significantly, she prepared a testament containing prophecies too explosive for immediate release, revelations that humanity was not yet ready to receive. This document was sealed with instructions that it remain unopened until 30 years after her death, creating a time capsule of forbidden knowledge scheduled to unseal itself in 2026. "I have seen the future of humanity until the year 3001, she declared in the preamble to this extraordinary document. The vistas her visions had revealed stretched across a millennium of human development, encompassing transformations so radical that contemporary minds could scarcely comprehend them. Yet not everything witnessed could be immediately shared. People are not prepared for such truth," she explained, justifying the temporal embargo she imposed upon her most profound revelations. The sealed prophecies would await a generation better equipped to absorb their implications without descending into panic or despair. The testament addressed matters of global significance that Vanga believed would reshape human civilization entirely. By the year 2050, she revealed, Earth would achieve unified governance under a single planetary authority that transcended the nation-states currently dividing humanity into competing factions. A universal religion would emerge, synthesizing truths from all spiritual traditions into a framework that ended millennia of sectarian conflict. Even language itself would unify, with humanity adopting a common tongue that eliminated barriers to communication that had plagued the species since Babel. These transformations would require upheaval, but their completion would inaugurate unprecedented harmony. The suffering that had characterized human existence throughout recorded history would finally find resolution in this transformed world. Wars would cease entirely, their causes dissolved by institutions that channeled competition into constructive rather than destructive expressions. Famine would become historical curiosity as agricultural and distribution systems achieved efficiency that eliminated scarcity. Disease would retreat before medical advances that extended human lifespans to 300 years, allowing individuals to accumulate wisdom across centuries rather than mere decades. The golden age that philosophers had dreamed about and prophets had promised would finally materialize in lived reality. Humanity's horizons would expand beyond terrestrial boundaries in this glorious future. Vanga spoke of travel to distant stars becoming routine, spacecraft carrying explorers to worlds that current technology could not even properly observe. The cosmic loneliness that had haunted human consciousness since astronomers revealed the universe's immensity would end through contact with other intelligent species. Humanity would take its place within a galactic community, no longer orphans in an indifferent cosmos, but participants in conversations spanning light years. The species that had once cowered in caves would stride among the stars. Yet the prophetess accompanied these luminous visions with warnings that tempered optimism with conditional uncertainty. All her prophecies would fulfill themselves only if humanity preserved faith in goodness through the trials preceding transformation. Should selfishness triumph over generosity, should greed overwhelm sharing, should hatred defeat love, then different futures awaited. The path toward golden ages was not guaranteed but chosen, each generation's decisions shaping possibilities available to successors. Vanga insisted that fate indicated directions rather than dictating destinations. Human agency remained sovereign over human destiny, despite whatever visions prophets might perceive. On the 11th of August, 1996, in a hospital room in Petrich where this narrative began, the most famous seer of the 20th century drew her final breath. She had lived 85 years, 60 of them bearing the burden of perception that separated her from ordinary humanity. Presidents and peasants had sought her counsel. Intelligence agencies had documented her utterances. Millions had organized their hopes and fears around words that emerged from behind her sightless eyes. Now the voice that had pronounced upon the fates of nations fell permanently silent, leaving behind archives of prophecy whose verification would occupy generations yet unborn. Her burial beside the Church of St. Paraskeva drew mourners from across the globe, dignitaries mingling with common people who had found guidance in her words. The president of Bulgaria declared a national day of mourning. Her gravestone bore an inscription of elegant simplicity. She saw the future and warned humanity. The modest tomb became a pilgrimage site visited by thousands annually, seekers hoping that proximity to her remains might somehow illuminate their own uncertainties. The blind woman, who had perceived what others could not, continued drawing those desperate for glimpses beyond the veil that separates present from future. 29 years have now elapsed since Vanga's passage from this world, and the hour approaches when her sealed testament must be opened according to the instructions she left behind. 2026 stands mere months away, bringing with it revelations that the prophetess deemed too powerful for earlier disclosure. What secrets await within that time-locked document? What warnings or promises did she reserve for a generation she would never meet? The accuracy of her verified predictions demands that we approach this unsealing with seriousness that mere curiosity does not capture. If she saw truly before, she may have seen truly again regarding matters we cannot yet imagine. The questions Vanga raised persist beyond her death with urgency that intensifies as prophesied dates approach. Will the eighth ruler emerge in 2027 or 2028 as she foretold? Will Russia indeed become the spiritual center of a transformed civilization? Will the catastrophes she pronounced upon America and Europe materialize as described? Each passing year brings opportunities for verification or refutation, testing the legacy of a blind peasant woman who claimed to perceive what God revealed to her through channels that science cannot explain. Whether believer or skeptic, none can remain indifferent to prophecies whose appointed hours draw near. Perhaps the deepest truth Vanga offered concerned not specific predictions, but the nature of prophecy itself. She insisted repeatedly that foretelling did not equal determining, that warnings existed precisely because futures could be changed through conscious choice. The wise person transforms destiny, while the fool submits to it. She taught those who sought certainty she refused to provide. Her prophecies were invitations to reflection rather than commands to resignation, challenges to recognize that human decisions shaped the outcomes she described. We remain authors of our collective story, regardless of what any oracle perceives. The story of Baba Vanga continues unfolding with each passing day, every global event subject to interpretation through frameworks she established decades ago. Whether she genuinely pierced the veil of time or simply spoke words vague enough to accommodate multiple outcomes, her influence upon millions remains undeniable. The blind woman from Petrich transformed how countless people understand their present moment and anticipate their future possibilities. Her legacy challenges us to consider what we truly believe about fate, free will, and the forces that shape human destiny across the centuries. Now, I want to hear from you. What prophecy of Vanga strikes you as most compelling, and which do you think history will ultimately refute? Watch my other videos exploring the mysteries that shape our world and the predictions that might reveal where humanity is heading. Share your thoughts in the comments below, whether you believe the blind prophetess genuinely saw tomorrow or simply told people what they wanted to hear. And if this journey through Vanga's extraordinary visions resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these prophecies that may yet prove more relevant than any of us dare to imagine.